One of the topics we're going to be focusing on this week is behavior theory. Now, some of what's in this presentation may be a review for many of you from past psychology classes, but I think it's important to review the concepts of behavior theory to have an understanding of some of the different clinical approaches based on this theory that you may see out in practice. So after this week, you should be able to define and describe common behavior paradigm techniques, explain the basics of clinical approaches based on behavior theory, and describe the complementary aspects of ABA therapy and OT practice. Behaviorism is a term used to describe how humans develop through conditioning and learning, and it equates learning with behaviors that can be readily observed and measured. As you can see here, there are several theorists who have contributed to our understanding of behavior theory, and I'll be presenting on some of the behavior concepts from each of these theorists throughout the rest of this presentation. There are several techniques common to the behavioral paradigm. The first one listed here is respondent conditioning, which is also known as classical conditioning. Classical conditioning suggests that learning a new behavior occurs through the process of association. There are three stages of classical conditioning. In the first stage, which is before conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus produces an unconditioned response in an individual. This means that a stimulus in the environment has produced a behavior which is unlearned or unconditioned, and therefore is a natural response which has not been taught. In this respect, no new behavior has been learned yet. In the second stage, or the conditioning stage, a stimulus which produces no response is associated with the unconditioned stimulus, at which point it now becomes known as the conditioned stimulus. In the third stage, which is after conditioning, the conditioned stimulus has been associated with the unconditioned stimulus to create a new conditioned response. Now, one of the most well-known experiments or examples of classical conditioning is Pavlov's dogs, but I'd encourage you to go online and check out some other examples that may help you to better understand this concept if you're not already familiar with it. Next is operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is a type of learning where behavior is controlled by consequences, specifically positive and negative reinforcement and punishment. Positive reinforcement strengthens a behavior by providing a consequence an individual finds rewarding. So an example would be giving a child a cookie after they eat their vegetables. Negative reinforcement is the removal of an adverse stimulus which is rewarding to the individual. It strengthens behavior because it stops or removes an unpleasant experience. An example would be lifting regular TV restrictions that the child may have if they eat their vegetables. Punishment is defined as the opposite of reinforcement since it's designed to weaken or eliminate a response rather than increase it. It's an aversive event that decreases the behavior that it follows. Positive punishment is used to decrease the behavior and is presenting something unpleasant after a behavior. A very classic example would be spanking a child when they do something bad, although this is certainly not a practice I recommend. Another example might be giving an extra credit or an extra assignment to a child if they hit or have some sort of negative behavior in class. Negative punishment is also used to decrease the behavior, and it involves removing something pleasant after a behavior. An example would be giving a child timeout during free play if they hit or act out in class. But consider whether timeout may be considered positive or negative. Now I'll quickly describe the other common behavior techniques listed on the slide. Task analysis is very similar to activity analysis in occupational therapy in that you're breaking down the steps of a task into the multiple discrete parts. Extinction is the disappearance of a previously learned behavior when the behavior is no longer reinforced. Shaping is gradually working to change a response by rewarding segments of the behavior and working towards the complete behavior, which is why task analysis is an important part of behavior theory. So an example would be, and many of you have probably used this with your community client or maybe in field work, but an example would be rewarding a child first for sitting down with just having some vegetables on the table, and then next rewarding the child for smelling the food, and then maybe picking up the fork and touching the vegetables with the fork, and so on and so forth. Fading is gradual reduction of prompting and rewarding. And chaining involves teaching steps one at a time, as in links in a chain. And there are both forward and backward chaining concepts. So in backward chaining, the child does the last step in a task, and the caregiver provides support for all the steps leading up to that last step. And forward chaining is the opposite, where the child completes the first step and then the caregiver provides support for the remainder of the task. There are several clinical approaches based on behaviorism, including applied behavior analysis, also known as ABA therapy, discrete trial training, positive behavioral interventions and supports, and naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions. The following definition of ABA comes from Autism Speaks, which says that behavior analysis focuses on the principles that explain how learning takes place. Positive reinforcement is one such principle. When a behavior is followed by some sort of reward, the behavior is more likely to be repeated. Through decades of research, the field of behavior analysis has developed many techniques for increasing useful behaviors and reducing those that may cause harm or interfere with learning. Applied behavior analysis is the use of these techniques and principles to bring about meaningful and positive change in behavior. A key aspect of ABA is conducting a functional behavior assessment. In a functional behavior assessment, you observe behaviors to examine relevant antecedents and consequences to help determine the function or the why of the behavior. It stems from the idea that both desirable and undesirable behaviors are learned and maintained through interactions with one's social and physical environment. There are many possible causes for the negative behaviors we observe in the children we work with, including obtaining a desired event or activity. They may do a negative behavior to escape or avoid undesired events, or have negative behaviors due to an inability to communicate. Also, sometimes the antecedent to a behavior is caused by a sensory issue, and as OTs, that might be something that we get asked to assess and provide recommendations for. But how do we as OTs tell if a child's observable reaction is truly due to a sensory processing issue and not just strictly behavior? This can be really tricky to tell the difference between, and one of your online activities for this week is to read an OT blog about this very topic. Also, reviewing the Analyzing Behaviors checklist under your online activities this week will also help you to better pinpoint how to differentiate between sensory and behavior. In the end, it's important to know when to refer to behavior specialists, and it's always beneficial to use an interdisciplinary approach to manage problematic behaviors we may see in the clients we work with. So going back to the clinical approaches, the next here on the list is discrete trial training. This is a method of teaching in which the adult uses adult-directed, mass trial instruction and reinforcers chosen for their strength, and clear contingencies and repetition to teach a child new skills. Let me pause for a second and click off the presentation to show you this video, which will offer you a visual of what discrete trial training looks like in action. Here we go.
Unit 3, Discrete Trial Teaching. Section 1, The Discrete Trial, SD, and Response. In DTT, the discrete trial is used to teach new behaviors. The definition of a discrete trial is presenting a learning opportunity in which the student's correct response will be reinforced. The discrete trial consists of 3 parts which correspond to the ABCs of behavior. These parts are the discriminative stimulus, or SD, the response, or R, and the stimulus reinforcer, or SR. Here's an example of a discrete trial. Look at me. Good looking! High five. As you saw, the SD was the instructor saying, "Look at me." The response was the student looking at the instructor. And the stimulus reinforcers were the instructor saying, "Good looking," giving a food treat and high-fiving the student.
Okay, so that was an example of discrete trial training, and it's important to keep in mind that Discrete trial training is one aspect of ABA therapy, but it's not, but it can also be used alone as its own therapy approach as well. Next on the list is positive behavioral interventions and supports. You may hear this referred to as PBIS, and this is a school-wide approach to make schools safe and promote positive behaviors. It's also a way for schools to decide how to respond to a child who misbehaves. It's based on principles of ABA and focuses on prevention of negative behaviors and also emphasizes consistency of approaches throughout school personnel. So consistency amongst how teachers, different educators, aides will respond to behavior and shape behavior in the classroom and school settings. Last, rather than targeting individual behaviors, pivotal response treatment, which is a type of naturalistic developmental behavioral intervention, targets quote-unquote pivotal areas of a child's development. These include motivation, response to multiple cues, self-management, and the initiation of social interactions. The philosophy is that by targeting these critical areas, PRT, or pivotal response treatment, will produce broad improvements across other areas of sociability, communication, behavior, and academic skill building. You'll be reading an article this week about the argument for the use of ABA therapy in conjunction with OT practice. ABA is a predominant intervention approach for individuals with autism and has shown strong evidence for treating symptoms of ASD and helping individuals with autism meet their goals. And yet there's almost no mention of the use of ABA within OT literature. The most commonly used intervention approach for individuals with ASD by occupational therapists is a sensory integration approach, which, as you guys have already learned this semester, has fairly weak evidence. So why aren't OT practitioners who work with the ASD population incorporating ABA into their practice more? The article will shed some more light on that specific question and discuss how ABA and OT may be more complementary than meets the eye. But some common criticisms and misconceptions of behaviorism include that it's denigrating to the human spirit, turns individuals into robots that only perform on demand and who can't generalize skills to other settings and situations, and that it's not client-centered and therefore does not take into consideration the inner motivation and interests of the child. Currently, the acquisitional frame of reference is the most common formal integration of behavioral approaches that's used within OT practice. However, it's important to note that several of the frames of reference you've learned about this semester include some aspects of behavioral theory. The bottom line is that if behaviors are interfering with successful engagement in occupations, then it's important for us as OTs to explore and understand the possible reasons for those behaviors. When faced with problematic behaviors, we must decide how we'll go about either stopping or eliminating the behavior, altering it, limiting the behavior, treating the primary cause, or ignoring the behavior to extinguish it. But harm to self and others must always be addressed immediately and should, be at the forefront of any intervention. In wrapping up, I hope you feel like you've developed a foundational understanding of behavior theory, or that this was a good review of concepts you've learned in classes in the past. As stated, behavioral concepts are interwoven into many pediatric OT frames of reference, and you'll be hearing from one group this week to learn more specifically about the acquisitional frame of reference and how it's used in practice to promote skill acquisition, including positive behaviors. Don't forget to complete the other online activities for the week. Thanks, guys.